Hello, my name is Jesan Sorrells, and this is Leadership Lessons from the Great Books Podcast, episode number 11. With my guest host today, a gentleman that you may know, Bruce Wayne. In deciding to apply his style and sensibilities to the Batman, Frank Miller has come up with a solution to the difficulties outlined above that is as impressive and elegant as any that I've seen. More strikingly still, he has managed to do it while handling a character who, in the view of the wider public that exists beyond the relatively tiny confines of the comic audience, sums up more than any other the essential silliness of the comic book hero. Whatever changes may have been wrought in comics themselves, the image of Batman most permanently fixed in the mind of the general populace is that of Adam West, delivering outrageously straight-faced camp dialogue while walking up a wall, thanks to the benefit of stupendous special effects and a camera turned on its side. To lend such a subject credibility in the eyes of an audience not necessarily enamored of superheroes and their trappings is no inconsiderable feat, and it would perhaps be appropriate to look a little more closely here at what exactly it is that Miller has done. I hope Frank will forgive me for calling him Miller. It seems a little brusque and rude, and I would certainly never do it to his face, but somehow it's just the sort of thing you call people you know quite well when writing introductions to books. The most immediate and overpowering difference is obviously in the portrayal both of the Batman and of Bruce Wayne, the man beneath the mask. Depicted over the years as alternatively a concerned do-gooder and revenge-driven psychopath, the character as presented here manages to bridge both of those interpretations quite easily while integrating them in a much larger and more persuasively realized personality. Every subtlety of expression, every nuance of body language serves to demonstrate that this Batman has finally become what he should have always been. He is a legend. Do we really want to take this that seriously? Well, yes. Because nihilism always winds up eating its own children. In the age we live in now, 2022, many years after the 1986 publication of The Dark Knight Returns by Frank Miller, Klaus Janson, and Lynn Varley, a world of insights is opened up due to the acidic impact of the presence of the never-ending now, and leaders can look everywhere, even in low art, for insights into the psychology of how to lead if they know how to tease those insights from the dross of almost everything else. The changes that Alan Moore, writer of Watchmen, which we will also cover in this podcast, mentioned in the open, have been rendered serious by audiences seeking the serious, or seeking to extend the serious out of the silly. The trappings of comic books and their sophisticated older siblings, graphic novels, blind us in the West to the power of narrative structures to get across subtle messages, intense critiques, and to even push narratives that one wouldn't believe would have serious traction. And this is the thing with The Dark Knight Returns. See, this book was written during a time when this idea of the Cold War, this idea of an existential crisis between East and West, was beginning to lose a bit of its luster. This book was written for an audience that had grown up on sophisticated entertainment fare and was looking at comics mostly as low art. Many years later, after the Marvel films and the infantilization of American audiences, the thing that has held on, the characterization that has resisted infantilization, is indeed Batman. Now, Bruce Wayne, or Batman, can be framed in a lot of different ways, particularly in our postmodern, progressive, socially justice-driven society and culture. He can be framed as a revenge-driven psychopath, as more mentioned in the open, or he can be framed as a progressive do-gooder. Christopher Nolan, by the way, tried that in the films. Being a progressive do-gooder or being a revenge-driven psychopath, which is kind of the direction that most of the comics are going in now, doesn't take away the essential significance, and it does nothing to dim the essential need for a Batman. It also doesn't eliminate the need for the essential understanding of what not only Batman, but all superheroes and costume vigilantes represent. Now, again, we'll explore this a little bit in Watchmen when we have our discussion there, Alan Moore's great book, but Frank Miller takes a little bit of a different turn with this. But first, we have to consider, what does it actually mean to be a costumed vigilante? And I quote, "In one sense, though, independent costumed crime fighters are by definition vigilantes. They take the law into their own hands. In the real world, this is generally regarded as, at best, problematic. For example, the British philosopher John Locke, 1632 to 1704, long ago persuasively argued that an important element of the defining conditions of civil society is that each of us gives up his right to private vengeance, delegating it to a legitimately formed government for the purposes of objective judgment and sentencing. It makes us all more secure on this theory to have the pursuit of punishment of wrongdoers be the delegated task of some agency of the state. On this view, it's wrong for me to try to apprehend or punish robbers, and this is the properly assigned function of the state's police force. In essence, we outsource violence, we outsource justice, we outsource force to the state. That's what we pay our taxes for. Except Americans are rabidly independent people. If you're listening to this in another country, like maybe India or Brazil or Bangladesh or Turkey or, I don't know, Japan or China or, well, even Canada, well, maybe not Canada, you may not realize, right, how rabidly independent Americans actually are. We are a nation state that came about because of people from other nation states immigrating here to experience the freedom to chart their own course against the collective vicissitudes of the state. This is walked out in all sorts of truly American behavior that seems bizarre from a distance, counterintuitive, and downright irrational to people observing us from other nation states through our media, including journalism, Hollywood films, and even YouTube, like you're observing me now. For instance, this is just the biggest one, the biggest critique against the United States, and it ties in well with the proper function of the state's police force, outsourcing vengeance, and of course, ideas of justice. So, in the United States of America, we are listed as one of the most heavily armed countries in the world, with around 6 million registered weapons and a whopping 300 million estimated unregistered ones. Think about that for just a minute. 6 million registered guns for around 348 million people, but then another 300 million that are unregistered, just sort of floating around in the ether. Now, that kind of statistic freaks people out who come from other cultures where gun laws are different, where the trust of the state is higher, and where the streak of independence or the rabidity towards independence may indeed be lower. And of course, it begs the question, at least in the context of superheroes and, of course, Batman, if you're wired to be independent because of circumstances or your own intentionally chosen mindset, who exactly are you going to call when someone breaks into your car? If you are one of those people with a weapon and or you live in a rural area on a massive continent. The myth of the West is more than just manifest destiny and Caucasian people imposing their will on unwilling natives, blacks, women, and everyone else in their path. It's way more complicated than that, and the complication exists most sharply in the story of Bruce Wayne. a man whose parents were gunned down in street violence, and yet he is wealthy, he is socially progressive, and he's highly traumatized. The other dynamic that gets lost in the movies, the television shows, and the endless digital ink spilled about Bruce Wayne and what he really gets up to at night is the fact that over the last 50 years or so, the guardrails of the state of the United States that used to be maintained and put up and polished by the elite leaders in media, politics, and culture have gradually moved so far away from regular people that they now appear to be out in the hinterlands somewhere. Bruce Wayne's frustration with this movement is not only reflected in how he deals with criminals in The Dark Knight Returns, but also in how the media as a driver for social norming and guardrail splitting is portrayed in the story. Equally parts feckless, dismissive, domineering, intellectually obtuse, and ever trying to know the truth and never really gaining any wisdom, eventually the opinionated, inexpert, blow-dried talking head journalist in The Dark Knight Returns gets taken out by a villain with laughing gas. And, if you are watching this on the video, you're going to get to see it. If you're listening to this on the podcast, I'd recommend you go check out The Dark Knight Returns. Oh, by the way, the laughing gas is located in dolls. Okay. It turns out that the current problems with the media, including low trust, bad hires, a loss of narrative, and the Jeffrey Zucker / Matt Lauer inability to keep pants on, didn't start, like most things, in the ever-present Instagram-driven now. Nope. All of that goes back to the 1980s. And I quote from Superheroes and Philosophy. Frank Miller's 1986 story about Batman, The Dark Knight Returns, explicitly examines the moral issues surrounding superhero vigilantism by reimagining Batman's psyche as much more deeply traumatized by his parents' murder. Batman here acknowledges the vigilante nature of the costumed crime fighter, telling a congressional committee, quote, "Sure, we're criminals. We've always been criminals. We have to be criminals," unquote. From The Dark Knight Returns directly, I believe it's on page, it's in chapter 4, I believe, of the book, or something like that. Superman's flying around and, trying to stop a nuclear weapon, right? Ruminating on Bruce. Clark remembers it. And I quote, "When the noise started from the parents' groups and the subcommittee called us in for questioning, you were the one who laughed. That scary laugh of yours." Of course Batman laughed. Of course he did. Because he knew the truth that the polite people who outsource their safety to the state don't understand, and maybe sometimes even fail to publicly acknowledge. He understood that if you want to get something done, sometimes you have to do it yourself. But he also understood, and leaders should pay attention to this, that sometimes if you outsource too much, if you delegate too much away, you wind up being a slave, or at the very minimum a servant, of the very thing to which you have delegated. This is a challenge for leaders. It's a challenge for superheroes. It's a challenge for the balance between too much justice and too little justice. The balance between too much outsourcing and too much taking it into your own hands. And of course he laughed, because the irony here is that if you're going to take it into your own hands, you have to become the very thing that you have outsourced away. You have to become a criminal. From The Dark Knight Returns, early in the book, Bruce Wayne and Jim Gordon are having a drink, and Bruce Wayne thinks or narrates, "As we part, Jim squeezes my shoulder and grins. You just need a woman," he says. And then he's walking down the street, while in my gut, the creature writhes and snarls and tells me what I need. I leave my car in the lot. I can't stand to be inside anything right now. I walk the streets of this city I'm learning to hate, the city that's given up, like the whole world seems to have. I'm a zombie, a flying Dutchman, a dead man, 10 years dead. What do we as leaders do when the world changes around us and we no longer understand or want to acknowledge the rules? How do we respond, adapt, and cope when the principles and pleasantries we thought were the glue that bound the society together dissolve away like so much superglue in the presence of acetone? When do we decide to leave the field and retire, and who or what gets to tell us to go? The Dark Knight Returns begins with this question. How do you know when it's time to leave? Who tells Michael Jordan to take the last shot? Who tells Tom Brady to retire? Who says to the champion Olympian or the really, really good baseball player, you know what? It's time for you to go. Who's really going to tell Bruce Wayne to stop? Leaders need to understand and have humility to plan for the time when they are no longer considered valuable commodities. In the world of the real, the world outside of, four-color comics, we call this succession planning. However, the reality is that if a leader perceives him or herself as the linchpin without which nothing can happen, then ego always eats the plan. And then, of course, if the ego doesn't eat the plan, there's the issue of who you hire to replace yourself. So Batman, in The Dark Knight Returns and in every iteration of the story, Batman by himself is kind of a complicated character. Only really works in the movies where Batman and the villains get to fight each other. Now, Bruce Wayne is surrounded by a supporting cast. Alfred, the Batmobile, the villains. But the one that has the one piece of his supporting cast that has resisted film is the one that is the most troubling. And it is the boys, or in the case of The Dark Knight Returns, the girl. Robin is a troubling character for most films because, well, quite frankly, it's really hard to set up succession for a superhero with a child. Who do you hire to replace yourself? Bruce initially hired, in the comics anyway, he initially hired Jesan Todd. Now, Jesan Todd was an impulsive and revenge-driven young man whose parents were killed by drugs and a disfigured former district attorney. Jesan Todd eventually, because of his own impulsiveness and his own anger and his own lack of ethics, was eventually beaten and then blown up by a psychopath in a purple clown suit. You can guess who that was. That's 0 for 1, by the way. Then Bruce Wayne hired Dick Grayson, a trapeze artist from the circus, whose parents, Mary and John, were killed in a circus accident by gangsters who wanted to extort money from the owner of the circus where they performed. Eventually, Dick would stick around with Bruce for quite some time, but he would eventually move on after maturing and becoming an adult in his own right. He would actually make it to adulthood. And he moved on from working with Bruce in the business of crime fighting and capes to creating his own persona, well outside the shadow of the Bat. That's 0 for 2, Bruce. Finally, there is the case of the new Robin, or relatively new, a kid named Tim Drake, a young man able to detect who Bruce really was, and also willing to work hard to become the person that his predecessor would have been, Dick Grayson, had he not been so willing to throw over Bruce's guidance. Turns out Clark Kent never had these succession problems. And that's the point. See, who do you hire to replace yourself? if you're a leader. You might not have 3 shots. You might just barely have 1. From The Dark Knight Returns, you sold us out, Clark. You gave them the power that should have been ours, just like your parents taught you to. My parents taught me a different lesson. Lying on this street, shaking in deep shock, dying for no reason at all. They showed me that the world only makes sense when you force it to. Of course he cheats. What else is he going to do? One of the things that's always interesting about Batman versus Superman, about the fights that Batman gets into and the battles that he has with other superheroes, the engagement and the arguments that comic book fans have with each other, and leaders should pay attention to this, is the idea, and it is one of the biggest knocks against Batman's character, and increasingly against Bruce Wayne the Man, is that he cheats to fight because he's not Superman or Wonder Woman or the Green Lantern. So, okay, let me go through this again for all the movie viewers who have been hanging out in the back for about the last 15 years. The main driver for Bruce, and you have to understand this, and we saw it in that clip there, the main driver for Bruce is his iron will. Of course, that and overwhelming narcissism and existential dread. But enough with the Nietzschean references. Look, the thing that drives Bruce, the thing that allows him to go toe-to-toe with Superman, the thing that allows him to wonder what he would do with Green Lantern's ring and lust for it in his heart, the thing that attracts him to Wonder Woman, even though eventually she goes off with Superman, the thing that drives Bruce is his iron will. And leaders should pay attention to this, because the will to do what the other guy won't, the will to cheat, the will to survive, the will to go in a different direction, perhaps potentially ethically or morally, is something that is often twisted by leaders. The will to win and the will to survive, the will to do what other people won't, of course, leads to the breaking of rules. It leads to a dichotomy that leaders will have to figure out the thread of and figure out which way they're going to walk. Sometimes the will to do what somebody else won't is the will to not do what somebody else will do. Think about that for a second. That iron thing, that thing that's inside of Bruce that drives him, also gives him his persistence and his perseverance. It gives him his indomitable spirit. And it is also the thing that inspires dread, not only in criminals, but implies and inspires dread even in his friends. This is why Batman as a character has no friends. He walks alone. And at the end of the movies, once again for the movie viewers in the back, when particularly the first one, or maybe it was the second Dark Knight movie by Christopher Nolan, Commissioner Gordon says to Batman, "We never said thank you." And Batman, played by Christian Bale, responds by saying, and this is exactly what Batman would say, "And you'll never have to." Leaders, what are you driven by? Are you driven by your iron will? Are you driven by persistence? Are you driven by being right? Are you driven by might? Are you driven by a desire and lust for power? Or are you just driven by the money? What is the thing inside of your tank? Are you driven by avoiding blame and taking credit? Or are you driven by taking credit and avoiding blame? Which one are you driven by? What is the gas in your tank? Where does that come from? What happens when all the chips are down? Your followers want to know what you're driven by, but they want to know even more the story of what you're driven by. This is part of the amazing impact in popular culture that, quite frankly, comic books have had, particularly in the last, I would say, 50 years of our American culture. Comic books have had an outsized impact on a lot of different areas: warping film, warping entertainment, even warping Hollywood, right? Now, for some, this is disturbing, those of us who like more adult-oriented fare, because the ridiculousness of all those capes and masks strikes us as being so absurd as to be not even worth contemplating seriously. However, when we can find lessons inside of the absurdity, now we raise up the thing that is absurd from the area of being just weird and able to be ignored to, well, being something else that might have value. Is this a sign that we live in an unserious culture? Well, perhaps. Is this a sign that we're in a culture of decline? Well, perhaps too. Maybe there's an argument that can be made there. Alan Moore did an interview a few years ago, and I want to quote from that as we think about this, as we turn the corner on talking about The Dark Knight Returns, as we begin to talk about the impact of Bruce Wayne on popular culture, but also on Bruce Wayne as the head of Wayne Corp and how he actually leads. From Alan Moore, and I quote, "I think the impact of superheroes on popular culture is both tremendously embarrassing and not a little worrying. Mass market superhero movies seem to be abetting an audience who do not wish to relinquish their grip on A, their relatively reassuring childhoods, or B, the relatively reassuring 20th century. I think that a good argument can be made for D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation as one of the first American superhero movies, and the point of origin for all of those capes and masks." As we turn the corner here, let's talk about Alan Moore's assertion about the point of origin for all those capes and masks. For those of us who remember, or those of us who don't, who are film files, or maybe who aren't, D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, released back in the early part of the last century, featured a story about Ku Klux Klansmen saving Southern white women from black degenerates. You know, folks hopped up on the Coca-Cola that had cocaine in it. Alan makes a couple of different assertions here that I think we have to examine in light of The Dark Knight Returns, but also in light of real lived leadership. The first assertion he makes is that the impact of superheroes on popular culture is both tremendously embarrassing and not a little worrying. Why is it embarrassing? Is it embarrassing because through what Frank Miller has done and Alan Moore did, is it because comic books and because of superheroes that we have raised up things that were once low art, that were once forgotten? Or is it tremendously embarrassing and not a little worrying because these things, as they so often do, have migrated to the mass market? Marvel movies, DC movies, franchise tentpole films that make billions and billions of dollars. Or is it tremendously embarrassing and not a little worrying that the Mouse House, you know, the one that Walt Disney built, the one that folks like Alan Moore, the nihilists, the existentialists, even the relative conservatives who have hope, like the Frank Millers or the Klaus Jansons or the Lynn Varleys in the comic book world, are embarrassed by, because that's the house that brought you Pinocchio and Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty? Or is it that they just don't respect what Walt Disney built? They don't look at it as a true art form. And so when Walt Disney comes along and the Disney Corporation to purchase Spider-Man and Batman and Superman and, well, Captain America and Iron Man, and then to turn them into entertainment for the masses, is this what becomes tremendously embarrassing and not a little worrying? The other assertion that Alan Moore makes here is that The movies seem to be abetting an audience that do not wish to relinquish their grip on A, their relatively reassuring childhoods, or B, the relatively reassuring 20th century. To folks like Moore and to leaders who think like him, I would give this riposte. Why shouldn't we give up a relatively reassuring 20th century? Why should we be eager to return to history? Why should we be eager to return to the potential for thermonuclear warfare or pandemics, inflation, and of course, death and destruction? See, if you're a nihilist or an existentialist, death and destruction matter just as much as life and growth and renewal. And more, by dismissing the relatively reassuring 20th century and saying that mass market superhero movies seem to be abetting an audience, is indicating by his words that this audience needs to somehow be shaken out of their ennui. They need to join the team. They need to get on board, get masked and vaxxed, and get with the program. Then, of course, the third point of Moore's 3 points comes about when he talks about D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. This is interesting, coming from a gentleman who comes from a country that's part of a continent, Europe, that engaged in geopolitical colonialism for much of the previous 500 years to the 21st century, and continues its machinations even at a much smaller and less impactful form in places like Africa, parts of Asia, and of course, South America. I'm not going to take that kind of critique, and neither should you, from a good old-fashioned colonialist like Alan Moore. So where are we at here when we come to capes and masks, when we come to how people hide their identity in order to do things that maybe they don't want to be spotted doing? What do we do with vigilantism at the end? Well, in The Dark Knight Returns, if you read to the end of the book, which I would recommend you do, Batman basically dies and then is resurrected by his ward, Carrie Kelly. Fourth time's a charm, turns out, with a female Robin, and begins to build an army. But not an army of people who previously believed in him, but an army of the future. An army of people who have heard of his legend and who want to be part of the story. An army of people driven not by social media, but driven by social action and social change. See, the weird thing about The Dark Knight Returns is that social do-gooder comes back out again, because what he begins to realize is that at the end of the day, a man can be killed, but a symbol lasts forever. And symbology, just like mythology, drives all kinds of things that the cynical people dismiss as being irrelevant. Leaders need to recognize that symbology is extremely powerful. Symbols mean things. Symbols align with other factors. This is why Superman wears an S on his chest. This is why Batman wears the bat logo on his chest, particularly surrounded by bright yellow against a gray and black backdrop. This is why Spider-Man wears a giant spider on his chest, or even why Green Lantern wears you guessed it, Green Lantern. This is why, because symbols mean something. Look, Diana's W on her bustier, right, as she flies around with her golden lasso of truth during Wonder Woman stuff, is there not necessarily to draw salacious attention to her. It is there to prove as a visual point that justice is coming, to prove as a visual point that anybody could be inside of that costume, from Batman's leotard to Diana Prince's bustier. Anybody could be inside of that. Anybody could be wearing that symbol. Anybody could be a hero, male or female, white or black, tall or short. Anyone can have the hero inside come out. This is a very American-centric way of looking at leadership, and not one that is easy to define. One of the interesting things about the 21st century is not that we are having a return to the 20th century. Instead, what we are having a return to is very old human behaviors wrapped up in new clothes. Not necessarily new symbols, just wrapped up in new clothes. The same old promises of freedom, of security, of peace, but now being brought to you by the titans of Facebook and Google and Instagram. You won't get freedom and you won't get safety. What you'll get is the Google symbol. What you'll get is the Facebook symbol. What you'll get is the Instagram symbol. But behind that symbol lies something far, far more murky and far more dangerous than the relatively reassuring 20th century. And then even behind that are behavioral algorithms, like we talked about last month, that challenge our conception of what it means to be human, what it means to be rational, and what it means to be effective. In The Dark Knight Returns, Bruce Wayne at the end provides a counterpoint to all of this. He says that yes, the individual can stand up against the state. Yes, the individual has a need, has a desire, has even, I would dare say, a responsibility to stand up against the state. When he's beating Clark Kent, he tells Clark that, of course, his parents taught him a different lesson. But he starts off by critiquing Clark and saying that Clark would always serve a badge or a flag. Superman stands as a symbol of state power, as an alternative to Batman, which stands as an example of individual power. The individual is paramount in the West and has been for the last 500 years because, well, quite frankly, a lot of people spent a lot of blood in a lot of mud over the course of the last 2,500 years, asserting that the individual has power against the state. But the state, in all of its corporatized, bureaucratized, and anesthetized forms, keeps right on fighting back. This is the struggle for leaders. Are you going to be part of the bureaucratic system, or are you going to be an individual? Are you going to stand up for the individual at all levels, from the womb to the tomb? Or are you going to stand up for the power of the collective, the ability of bigger to be better, the ability of the big to dominate the small? As we go into next month on this podcast, we're going to be talking about the Russians. And I don't specifically mean the current Russians. We're going to be talking about old Russians, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, Solzhenitsyn and Chekhov. The reason why this is important to discuss is because even in Watchmen, the geopolitical dynamics of Russia versus the United States showed up. And of course, in 1986, as The Dark Knight Returns, these dynamics were at play underneath Frank Miller's writing, even though they are not directly addressed, except, of course, when there's a thermonuclear weapon that goes off. It turns out that Superman is indeed an American and not Russian. Otherwise, all the people in Frank Miller's book would be dead. Russia and the United States, twin poles, the collective versus the individual, totalitarianism versus, well, freedom. Leaders have to choose. You have to make a decision. You have to decide which side of the aisle you are on. And even in your own organization and in your own culture, what kind of leader are you going to be? So when you read the Russian writers, it is no irony here. There's no irony here when we read the Russian writers. As a matter of fact, one of the things that jumps out from the Russian writers, from all of them, is their desire to explore this idea of the individual trapped inside of a collective state, where that collective state presses inexorably down upon them, as it does in books like Milan Kundera's The Unbearable Lightness of Being. Go back and listen to that podcast. And as it does press down on the individual, moral decay kicks in, and people lose their way, they lose their meaning, and they lose their purpose. All of which is reflected, but then redeemed at the end by Frank Miller, Klaus Janson, and Lynn Varley in The Dark Knight Returns. I cannot think of a better book to define our current geopolitical nightmare. One that we always seem to revisit time after time. And that's it for me. Follow us on all the places that you follow us. Please subscribe to Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. Please tell your friends. Please like and share. Please also check out the HSCT website for all products and solutions. Please check out the Leading Keys website for products and solutions, our remote training services, our books, our trainings that will help you become a better leader. And watch this space for more information about our upcoming book, 12 Rules for Leaders, a foundational guide to intentional leadership, coming in April 2022. Please also go to JesanSorrells.com for more blogs and more posts about how you can be a better leader, and check out all of our YouTube channels online. Thanks, and have a great rest of your leadership day. Out.